We often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight, we turn our attention to the year 1881 and the solemn story of President James A. Garfield. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best as it can be told. In the spring of 1881, America was a nation grappling with the deep wounds of its recent Civil War and the turbulent politics of Reconstruction. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with political ambition. The dominant issue of the day was civil service reform. For decades, a spoils system had been in place, allowing victorious political parties to distribute government jobs to their supporters, regardless of qualification. This practice bred corruption and fierce factionalism. The Republican Party itself was split between the stalwarts who supported the spoils system and the half-breeds who advocated for reform. Navigating this treacherous landscape was the newly inaugurated 20th President of the United States, James Abram Garfield. A thoughtful and scholarly man, Garfield aimed to unite his fractured party and reform the system from within. But his efforts would make him a target, placing him at the center of a storm of political entitlement that was about to break in the most violent way imaginable. James A. Garfield was the quintessential American success story. Born in a humble log cabin in Orange, Ohio in 1831, he was the last of the log cabin presidents. His father died when he was just an infant, leaving his mother to raise 4 children in poverty. From these beginnings, Garfield displayed a voracious appetite for learning. He worked as a canal boat driver to pay for his education, eventually graduating with honors from Williams College. He became a professor, a college president, and a lay preacher. When the Civil War erupted, he answered the call to duty, rising to the rank of Major General in the Union Army, distinguishing himself at the battles of Middle Creek and Chickamauga. His heroism on the battlefield propelled him into national politics. He was elected to Congress, where he served for 18 years, earning a reputation as a skilled orator and a man of integrity. In 1880, at a deadlocked Republican National Convention, he emerged as a dark horse candidate and won the presidency. He was a devoted husband to his wife, Lucretia, and a loving father to their 5 children. He entered the White House in March 1881, not as a political firebrand, but as a reconciler, hoping to heal the nation's divisions and bring a new era of clean government. He had only 4 months to try. The man who would bring President Garfield's ambitions to a halt was a study in failure and delusion. Charles Julius Guiteau was a 40-year-old drifter who had failed at nearly everything he attempted. He had been an unsuccessful lawyer, a failed evangelist for a utopian religious sect, and a deadbeat who skipped out on rent and bills. What Guiteau lacked in ability, he made up for in an unshakable sense of self-importance. He was convinced of his own genius and believed he was destined for greatness. In the 1880 presidential election, Guiteau attached himself to the Republican cause. He penned a rambling, nonsensical speech titled Garfield versus Hancock, which he had printed and distributed, though it was largely ignored. After Garfield's victory, Guiteau became consumed by a singular obsession.
He believed his insignificant speech had been the decisive factor in the election, and therefore he was owed a prestigious government post as a reward. He envisioned himself as the American ambassador to Paris. He moved to Washington, D.C., and began relentlessly pestering Garfield and Secretary of State James Blaine, showing up at the White House and government offices day after day. He was repeatedly rebuffed, dismissed as just another office seeker in a city full of them. But in Guiteau's warped mind, this rejection was a grave injustice. His sense of entitlement curdled into a murderous rage. He came to believe that President Garfield's death was a political necessity and a divine command from God.
The morning of July 2, 1881, was hot and humid in Washington, D.C. President Garfield was in high spirits. He was preparing to leave the capital for a summer vacation, starting with a trip to his alma mater, Williams College, where he was scheduled to deliver a speech. He arrived at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station on what is now Constitution Avenue shortly after 9 a.m., accompanied by two of his sons, James and Harry, and his Secretary of State, James Blaine. The station was bustling, but security for the president was practically non-existent. It was an era when the public had easy access to its leaders. As Garfield walked through the ladies' waiting room, arm in arm with Secretary Blaine, a figure emerged from the crowd behind them. It was Charles Guiteau. He had been stalking the president for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. He raised a .44 caliber British Bulldog revolver and fired. The first bullet grazed the president's arm. Garfield cried out, "My God, what is this?" Guiteau stepped closer and fired a second time. The bullet struck the president in the back, shattering a rib and lodging behind his pancreas. President Garfield collapsed to the floor, mortally wounded. Pandemonium erupted in the station as onlookers screamed and scrambled for cover. The dream of a new era had just been shattered by two gunshots. Charles Guiteau made no attempt to flee the scene. As chaos engulfed the train station, he calmly walked away, only to be apprehended immediately by a policeman who had rushed to the commotion. Upon his arrest, Guiteau was strangely triumphant. He declared, "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts. I did it, and I want to be arrested. Arthur is president now." This bizarre proclamation revealed his motive. He believed that by killing Garfield, he was elevating Vice President Chester A. Arthur, a leader of the stalwart faction, to the presidency. In Guiteau's deluded mind, this would ensure that deserving stalwarts like himself would finally receive their political appointments. News of the assassination attempt spread rapidly across the country via telegraph wires, plunging the nation into a state of shock and disbelief. Crowds gathered in cities, anxiously awaiting updates on the president's condition. The public, still scarred by the assassination of Abraham Lincoln just 16 years earlier, was horrified that another of its leaders had been struck down. The initial shock soon gave way to a mixture of profound grief and intense anger directed at the assassin, a man whose pathetic ambitions had brought a nation to its knees.
President Garfield did not die immediately. Instead, he lingered for 79 agonizing days. His ordeal became a national vigil, but it was also a tragic showcase of the limitations of 19th-century medicine. After being moved back to the White House, a succession of doctors attended to him. Their primary goal was to find and extract the bullet. In an age before X-rays and with little understanding of germ theory, the physicians repeatedly probed the wound with unsterilized fingers and surgical instruments, searching for the projectile. This unhygienic practice almost certainly introduced the infection that would ultimately claim his life. They created a false passage, a new channel in his body that became a breeding ground for bacteria. As Garfield weakened from blood poisoning, his body racked with fever and chills, inventors from across the country offered their assistance. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, designed a primitive metal detector he called an induction balance to locate the bullet. He tested the device at the White House, but his efforts failed, likely because of interference from the metal bed springs on which the president was lying. Garfield's suffering was immense, yet he bore it with a quiet fortitude that earned him the admiration of the world. In early September, to escape the suffocating Washington heat, he was carefully transported by train to a seaside cottage in Elberon, New Jersey. But it was too late.
On the evening of September 19, 1881, President James A. Garfield suffered a massive hemorrhage and a fatal heart attack, brought on by the rampant infection and an aneurysm that had formed near the bullet's path. His last coherent words were to his chief of staff, "Swaim, can't you stop this pain?" The long, painful vigil was over. The nation he had led for just 200 days was plunged into mourning. An autopsy later revealed the tragic irony of his treatment. The bullet had lodged in a place where it was relatively harmless and would likely have become safely encapsulated by tissue had it been left alone. The cause of death was not the gunshot itself, but sepsis and hemorrhage brought on by his doctor's relentless, unsterile probing. The physicians had, with the best of intentions, killed their patient. Vice President Chester A. Arthur, the man Guiteau had hoped to empower, took the presidential oath of office in the early hours of September 20th. The nation, draped in black, prepared for the funeral of a president whose great promise had been extinguished by a madman's bullet and the well-meaning but fatal ignorance of his doctors. The trial of Charles Guiteau began in November 1881 and quickly descended into a bizarre public spectacle. It was one of the first high-profile cases in the United States to use the insanity defense. Guiteau's defense team argued that he was legally insane and could not be held responsible for his actions, a condition they termed monomania. The prosecution countered that while Guiteau was eccentric and had a monstrous ego, he was legally sane. They argued that he had carefully planned the assassination, purchased the gun, and stalked the president, proving he knew right from wrong. Guiteau himself became the trial's central, disruptive figure. He constantly interrupted the proceedings with loud outbursts, delivered rambling speeches, passed notes to reporters, and insulted the judge, his own lawyers, and the witnesses. He even solicited legal advice from spectators in the courtroom. He sang songs and recited epic poems, turning the solemn affair into a circus. He insisted that he had not killed the president, but that the doctors had. While this claim contained a kernel of truth regarding the medical malpractice, his argument was lost amid his manic behavior. The American public followed the trial with rapt attention, and their outrage at the crime left little room for sympathy. They saw Guiteau not as a madman, but as an evil and calculating killer who deserved to pay the ultimate price. On January 25, 1882, after deliberating for only an hour, the jury found Charles Guiteau guilty of murder. Upon hearing the verdict, Guiteau unleashed a torrent of curses at the jury. He was sentenced to death. He spent his final months in jail writing his autobiography and an epic poem titled, "I Am Going to the Lordy." On June 30, 1882, Charles Guiteau was led to the gallows in Washington, D.C. He remained defiant to the end, waving to the crowd and reciting a poem he had written for the occasion. His execution brought a grim sense of closure to the nation. However, the most profound consequence of Garfield's assassination was not Guiteau's death, but the political reform it inspired. The crime laid bare the toxic nature of the spoils system, which had directly fueled Guiteau's sense of entitlement and rage. Public outcry was immense. The new president, Chester A. Arthur, ironically the very man Guiteau thought would champion the old system, rose to the occasion. He surprised his critics by championing reform. In 1883, President Arthur signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act into law. This landmark legislation dismantled the spoils system, establishing that federal government jobs should be awarded on the basis of merit, determined through competitive exams rather than political affiliation. It was a monumental step toward a more professional and less corrupt government, a legacy forged from a national tragedy.
The assassination of James A. Garfield stands as a profound tragedy in American history. It cut short the life of a man of immense intellect and integrity, whose presidency lasted a mere 6.5 months. We are left to wonder what he might have accomplished. Yet his death served as a catalyst for critical change. It forced a national reckoning with the corrupt political patronage system, leading to reforms that shaped modern American governance. The case also marked a painful turning point for the medical profession. The president's agonizing death highlighted the deadly consequences of unhygienic surgical practices and spurred a greater acceptance of Joseph Lister's antiseptic theories in the United States. James Garfield's story is a solemn reminder of how the act of one disturbed individual can alter the course of a nation, and how even in the darkest of moments, lessons can be learned that pave the way for a better future. Thank you for spending this time with us. Reflecting on these past events is a way of remembering the individuals involved and the impact their stories had on their communities. If you have any thoughts on today's case, we invite you to share them respectfully in the comments below. We hope you will join us again for our next true crime case.